The courtroom was so quiet, I could hear the air conditioning click on. The judge set down the financial statement, looked over the rim of her glasses at my husband, and said, "Mr. Ashworth, it appears you were operating under a significant misunderstanding about your wife's finances." Nathaniel's smile disappeared like someone had switched off a light behind his eyes. Beside him, his attorney went very still, the way people go still when they realize a plan has already failed and there's nothing left to do but watch it fail. 2 rows back, his mother, Diane, leaned toward the man next to her and whispered something I couldn't hear. Then her eyes found mine, and I watched the blood leave her face in real time. I kept my hands folded in my lap and said nothing. The judge turned a page. According to the verified records before this court, Mrs. Ashworth's net worth is approximately $31.4 million. Diane stood up so fast her chair screeched against the floor. Then her knees buckled and she went down. Nathaniel stared at me like I'd become a stranger wearing his wife's face. Here's the strange part. I had never once wanted him to find out about the money, not because I was ashamed of having it. Because 3 weeks before that courtroom, I had still believed, genuinely, foolishly believed, that I was married to a man who loved me for reasons that had nothing to do with a bank statement. That belief died on a Friday night in a hotel lobby in Seattle, and it took the rest of the story to bury it properly. 3 weeks before that courtroom, I sat in a wood-paneled law office in downtown Denver, listening to an attorney read my grandfather's will out loud. My grandfather, Walter Bennett, was the kind of man who drove the same rusted-out pickup for 18 years and lectured anyone who paid more than $4 for coffee. He wore a canvas barn coat with a torn pocket well into his 80s. To the rest of the world, he looked like a modest retired contractor scraping by on a pension. I knew he had more than that. I just never knew how much more. My mother sat to my left. My children, Owen and Lily, perched near the window, half listening, half watching the traffic on 16th Street. My husband, Nathaniel, had cleared his afternoon to be there, which at the time felt like love. Looking back, it felt like something closer to reconnaissance. The attorney, a sharp, silver-haired woman named Margaret Hale, adjusted her glasses and began. "There are a number of smaller bequests," she said, "but the principal beneficiary of the estate is Claire." I looked up me. She nodded and kept reading. Investment portfolios, 2 commercial properties in Lodoo, a minority stake in a private manufacturing company my grandfather had quietly helped fund 30 years earlier, and a family trust established 13 years prior with my name on every page. My grandfather hadn't just left me money. He'd left me control of an empire he'd spent a lifetime pretending not to have. My throat closed. Why didn't he ever tell me? Margaret gave me a small, knowing smile. Because Walter believed that knowing too soon changes the way people look at you. That sentence would come back to haunt me exactly 4 days later. In the parking garage, Nathaniel leaned toward me, voice low, almost casual. "So how much are we talking?" "I don't know yet." "You have to have some idea." "I really don't." He leaned back against the car, and for one unguarded second, something moved across his face that had nothing to do with happiness for me. It looked like arithmetic. I had known this man for 16 years, and I had never once seen him do math with his eyes before. We drove home in separate cars because he had another meeting. The next morning, over coffee, he asked again. Then the morning after that. Each time I told him the truth, "I don't know yet, we're still working through it," and each time his patience thinned by a fraction of a degree, so slowly I told myself I was imagining it. Then one night he said something I should have written down and framed. "We'll need to figure out how we're going to handle everything." Everything. At the time I thought he meant our future. I have never been more wrong about anything in my life. Nathaniel had a work trip to Seattle that Friday. Lily thought it would be hilarious to surprise him with the cheesecake from his favorite bakery. Owen wanted an excuse to see the Space Needle. I wanted to watch my husband's face light up when his family showed up unannounced after a long week of meetings. We flew out Friday afternoon, checked into a hotel 3 blocks from his, and planned to surprise him at dinner. We never made it to dinner. We were crossing the lobby of his hotel when I saw him near the restaurant entrance. He wasn't alone. A woman in a navy blazer stood close beside him, one hand resting lightly on his forearm. He laughed at something she said, the real laugh, the one I hadn't heard directed at me in months. I stopped walking. Owen bumped into my shoulder from behind. Mom. I raised a hand. Stay here. We were partially hidden behind a marble column and a display of orchids, close enough to hear fragments carried on the lobby's terrible acoustics. The woman asked something I couldn't fully catch, something about whether she would put up a fight. Nathaniel actually smiled when he answered, "She doesn't have the money to fight me." My stomach dropped through the floor. "And the inheritance?" the woman asked. He glanced around the lobby, not toward us, just a reflex, the paranoia of someone used to being careful. Once the divorce is filed, we'll find out exactly what she has. I stopped breathing. Inheritance, divorce, find out what she has. 3 phrases that should never share a sentence, all sitting comfortably together in my husband's mouth. Then he said the sentence that hurt worse than anything else that night. "I've already spoken to a lawyer." I stood behind that column and listened to the man I had built 16 years with discuss the death of our marriage the way other people discuss a merger. I looked at my children, Lily still holding the cheesecake box, Owen watching my face for a cue, and I understood I had exactly 2 options. Walk into that restaurant and detonate everything on the spot, or stay quiet long enough to understand precisely what I was up against. I chose silence, not because I was weak, because I needed information more than I needed a scene. I took the kids back to the airport that night. On the flight home, Lily fell asleep against my arm. Owen stared out the window for 2 hours before he finally asked, "Why didn't we surprise Dad?" I looked at my son and said the only honest thing I had. Sometimes you learn something before you're ready to hear it. After the kids were asleep, I called Margaret. She picked up on the second ring. "Claire, is everything all right?" No, I told her everything, the lobby, the woman, the lawyer, the phrase that had lodged itself permanently in my chest. There was a long pause on the line. Then, "Don't confront him yet." "Why not?" "Because if Nathaniel is already maneuvering around your inheritance, we need to know exactly how far he's gotten before he knows we're watching." I closed my eyes and pressed my forehead to the cold kitchen window. Then Margaret said the sentence that turned my blood to ice water. "Claire, someone has already contacted my office asking questions about your grandfather's trust." "Who?" Another pause, longer this time. "Your husband's attorney." I sat alone at my kitchen table in the dark, staring at the small red light on the microwave clock, and understood that whatever I thought my marriage was, it had already ended days ago. In a lawyer's office I hadn't been invited to. 3 weeks later, that same man would stand in a courtroom cert. He was divorcing a woman with nothing. He had no idea what my grandfather had left me, and he had far less idea what I had already learned about him. The next morning, I sat across from Margaret, while she spread documents across her conference table like a hand of cards. She wasn't ready to show me all at once. "Before we go further," she said, "I need you to understand something. If Nathaniel is preparing for a divorce, anything you say about your grandfather's estate could become ammunition." I stared at the papers. "So he knows something's there." "He knows there's something. That isn't the same as knowing how much. And we're keeping it that way." "We're keeping it exactly that way." For 16 years, I had thought of Nathaniel as the person I called when the furnace broke, when Owen spiked a fever, when my mother needed a ride to a doctor's appointment. Now my own attorney was teaching me to build a wall between myself and him. It was one of the more disorienting mornings of my adult life. "Is the inheritance actually mine?" I asked. "Fully mine?" "That depends on how the assets were structured and titled. Your grandfather set the trust up years ago. Some of it is clearly separate property, but we need to document every piece of it carefully, starting now." She slid a folder across the table. Inside was a printed email, sent from Nathaniel's attorney to a private banking division, asking, in the dry, careful language lawyers used to sound like they're asking nothing at all, whether it was possible to determine the value of assets held inside a family trust during divorce proceedings. My hands went cold. He's already investigating. Yes. I checked the date stamped at the top. It had been sent 2 full days before the will was even read to me. How is that possible? I asked. How could he know before I did? Margaret didn't answer right away. That, she said quietly, is what we need to find out. For the first time, I let myself wonder whether whatever this was had started before my grandfather even passed away. I drove home with calling ahead. Nathaniel was already there, sitting at the kitchen island with his laptop open, wearing the gray quarter zip I'd bought him 2 Christmases ago. For one unguarded second, the sight of him nearly cracked something open in me. This was the man who had held my hand through my father's funeral, who had slept beside me for 16 years, who I had once believed I would grow old with. Hey, he said, glancing up. Hey. How was your day? Fine, I set my bag down. Did you talk to the attorney? My chest tightened. About what? The estate. There it was again, the same question wearing a slightly different outfit. I don't know much yet, I said. Did she tell you about the properties? No. The trust. I don't know, Nathaniel. He closed the laptop with a small, deliberate click. You don't have to be secretive with me. I almost laughed out loud. Not because it was funny, because after Seattle, that sentence sounded like the punchline to a joke only I understood. I'm not aware that I'm being secretive, I said evenly. He stood up, hands in his pockets. I'm just saying, whatever your grandfather left you, we need to make smart decisions together. We're a family. I glanced toward the hallway where Owen's cleats and Lily's backpack lay in their usual chaotic pile. For years, family had meant safety to me. That night, standing in my own kitchen, it sounded like leverage. I'll let you know when I understand everything myself, I said. His jaw tightened. Fine. He walked out. I stood there until I heard our bedroom door click shut down the hall. That was the first night I moved important documents into a fireproof safe I'd bought without telling him. It was also the first night I began replaying the last several years of our marriage with new eyes. The way he'd once asked, out of nowhere, whether my grandfather owned commercial property. The way he'd rushed me through refinancing paperwork and told me not to bother reading every page. The way his interest in our joint accounts had sharpened right around the time Walter's health began to decline. At the time, I'd called it curiosity. Now I wondered if it had been rehearsal. The papers arrived the following Monday at 9 in the morning. A process server stood on my porch in a windbreaker, clipboard in hand. Mrs. Ashworth, I have legal documents for you. My hands shook as I signed for them. I closed the door and stood in the entryway for almost a full minute before I could make myself open the envelope. Nathaniel hadn't called, hadn't texted, hadn't even waited for a conversation. He had simply filed. The petition requested temporary control over several marital assets and stated that my financial position was uncertain, with potential undisclosed assets. I read that phrase 3 times. He was accusing me of hiding money from him, while his own attorney had been quietly investigating my inheritance for weeks. I called Margaret immediately. The papers came. I expected that, she said. How does it read? He's claiming I might be hiding assets. That's a common opening move. It doesn't mean he can simply take the trust because he filed first. We prepare, and we prepare carefully. That afternoon, Nathaniel came home early and set a folder on the dining table without a word. You should sign these, he said. I didn't touch it. What is it? An agreement to simplify things. Simplify what exactly? The divorce. There's no point dragging this out. Then he smiled, the same smile from the Seattle lobby, easy, almost amused. You don't have the money to fight me, Claire. The room went silent in a way that had weight to it. I hadn't realized Owen was standing in the hallway until he spoke. Dad. Nathaniel turned. This is an adult conversation, bud. You're the one who said, she doesn't make real money. I watched something crack across my husband's face. Not guilt exactly, more like the discomfort of being quoted accurately. Go upstairs, he said. Owen didn't move until I touched his shoulder gently. It's okay, go finish your homework. He looked at me, then his father, then went. Once he was gone, Nathaniel lowered his voice. You're making this harder than it needs to be. I looked down at the folder and pushed it back across the table, untouched. No, you made it hard the day you decided my value depended on what you thought I owned. For just a moment, real uncertainty flickered across his face, then it vanished. You'll regret fighting me on this. I'm not trying to fight you, I said quietly. I'm just not going to let you fright me into signing something I haven't read. He left without another word. That night, after the kids were asleep, I sat alone in my grandfather's old study, which I'd inherited untouched, his books still lined up by subject, his brass desk lamp still angled the way he'd left it. In the top drawer, I found a sealed envelope with my name on it in his handwriting, dated 6 months before. He died. Inside were just a few lines. Claire, people will treat you differently once they learn what I've left you. Remember that their reaction says everything about them and nothing about you. Protect what's been entrusted to you, but don't ever let money convince you that you're worth more than any other soul on this earth. Your character was always the real inheritance I cared about. I read it twice and cried, not over the money, but because my grandfather had understood something about people that I hadn't yet learned the hard way. Wealth doesn't create character flaws. It just stops hiding them. And my husband's disguise was already coming apart at the seams. The next morning I told Margaret I wanted to know everything, no matter how ugly. We start with the trust, she said. And Nathaniel, we let him keep believing he's still the one holding the cards. I spent that night tearing through filing cabinets, old emails, tax folders, and boxes I hadn't opened since we moved into the house. Near midnight, I found a folder I'd completely forgotten about, copies of paperwork Nathaniel had asked me to sign 3 years earlier. A refinancing agreement. An authorization form giving him broader access to an account I rarely used. A document connected to a commercial property I didn't remember discussing. I photographed every page and sent them to Margaret. Her reply came within 20 minutes. Do not discuss any of this with Nathaniel. She called the next morning. These could matter a great deal. How much? Potentially vary. One of these gives him access to far more financial information than I think you realized you were granting at the time. None of it transferred ownership of anything from the trust that hadn't existed yet, but it painted a picture, a pattern of quiet financial positioning that contradicted the story Nathaniel was now telling in his own filings. Why would he start this before the divorce, before the inheritance even existed? I asked. Because preparation, Margaret said, often begins long before the other person realizes there's a problem. I stood in my kitchen while Owen and Lily got ready for school and thought about how, for 16 years, I had believed Nathaniel and I were building a life together. Maybe I had been building. Maybe he had been auditing. That afternoon a text came through. We need to talk tonight, just us. I nearly ignored it. Instead, I agreed. He arrived around 7 and sat across from me at the same table where he'd once slid over a folder full of ultimatums. I don't want this to get ugly, he said. I almost laughed. You filed before you even told me you had a lawyer. I was protecting myself. From what? He didn't answer directly. I already knew what he meant from the inheritance, from not knowing what I had. You could have asked me, I said. I did, you said you didn't know. Because I didn't. He leaned back. Let's be honest, Claire, your grandfather was wealthy. You knew there was money coming. I knew he had assets. I didn't know what he was leaving me, or when, or how. You always do this. Do what? Pretend you don't understand how things work. Something in me went still and quiet, not angry, just clear, the way a lake goes glassy right before dawn. You've already decided who I am in your head, I said. You decided it the moment you thought there might be money attached to me. He didn't respond to that. Instead he said, I think we should sell the house. No. You don't get to decide that alone. I know, and I think you should take back the agreement your attorney drafted. You haven't even read it. My attorney has. His expression hardened. You're really going to make this difficult? I'm going to make it fair, I said. He stood. You're going to regret this. I already regret something, I said, trusting you without asking enough questions. He left. I sat at the table until I heard the garage door rumble shut, then silence. I thought that conversation was the bottom. It wasn't even close. The next morning, Nathaniel served a formal request for financial disclosure, trust documents, investment statements, property valuations, everything connected to my grandfather's estate. Let him ask, Margaret said when I called panicked. The law entitles him to what the law entitles him to, nothing more. She explained something I wished someone had told me a decade earlier. Inherited assets are often treated very differently from property accumulated jointly during a marriage, depending on how they're structured and whether they've ever been commingled with shared funds. Financial literacy, I was learning at 41 years old, wasn't a luxury for wealthy people. It was armor everyone needed, and almost no one was taught to wear. Then Margaret showed me something I wasn't prepared for: a string of emails between Nathaniel and his attorney, obtained through the proper discovery process. In one, dated the week of the W. Ill reading, Nathaniel had written, "If the trust is as large as I think it is, we need to move quickly." I read it twice. Then a second message, sent 2 days later: "She won't know what she's entitled to, we can negotiate from there." My hands tightened around the printed page. This wasn't a marriage falling apart over incompatibility or lost love. This was a financial campaign, and he'd been counting on my ignorance to be his advantage. "What do we do with this?" I asked. Margaret closed the folder gently. "We let the evidence speak for itself." I finally understood what my grandfather meant in his letter. The money hadn't changed Nathaniel. It had simply taken away the coat he'd been wearing over it. That evening, I sat with Owen and Lily while they ate pizza off paper towels at the counter. "Is Dad still mad?" Lily asked. "Dad and I are working through some adult problems," I said carefully. "Are we going to be okay?" I reached over and took her hand. "Yes." Owen looked up. "Even if you get divorced?" "Even then." He seemed to relax, then asked the question I wasn't ready for. "Mom, did Dad leave because of the money?" I looked at both of my children and made a decision right there about what kind of story they would carry into their own adult lives. "No," I said gently. "Your dad made his own choices. The money just showed us what those choices meant." The first settlement conference was held on a Tuesday morning in a conference room downtown with a bad framed print of the Denver skyline and a coffee machine that never quite finished brewing. I arrived 15 minutes early. Nathaniel was already seated, one ankle crossed over his knee, radiating the kind of ease that comes from believing you've already won. He caught my eye and smiled, not warmly, almost triumphantly. His attorney opened with the usual language about resolving things efficiently. Margaret agreed, then methodically worked through the house, the vehicles, the retirement accounts, custody logistics, until she reached the inheritance. Mr. Ashworth believes the inheritance should factor into the overall division of marital assets, his attorney said. "We understand his position," Margaret replied, sliding a document across the table. "The trust has already been reviewed in full. We'd like additional records. You'll receive exactly what you're legally entitled to, nothing more." Nathaniel leaned toward me. "I'm not asking for anything unreasonable, Claire." I said nothing. His attorney pressed on, requesting further examination of the trust. Margaret nodded pleasantly, then reached for a second folder. "This concerns Mr. Ashworth's own financial disclosures," she said. Nathaniel blinked. "What about them?" "Your initial filing states that your wife's financial position was uncertain, and that she may have concealed assets. Yet your correspondence with counsel shows you were already investigating the family trust before the divorce petition was ever filed." His jaw shifted, just barely. I was trying to understand the situation. "That's reasonable," Margaret said evenly. "So why did your filing state you had no knowledge of the inheritance at all?" Silence. His attorney leaned in and whispered something urgent. I didn't know the exact amount, Nathaniel finally said. You knew about the trust. I suspected. You contacted a financial institution to ask about accessing information from it. I was asking questions. That, Margaret said calmly, is exactly what the records show. Nathaniel looked at me, searching for something. I gave him nothing. Then Margaret produced the folder of old signed documents, the refinancing papers, the account authorization, the property form. None of these transferred ownership of anything, she explained to the room, but together they demonstrate a pattern of financial positioning that directly contradicts the picture Mr. Ashworth has presented to this process. Why wasn't this disclosed earlier? His attorney asked him quietly. I didn't think it was relevant. It became relevant, Margaret said, the moment you accused your wife of hiding assets. Then came the email dated before the will reading. If the trust is as large as I think it is, we need to move quickly, read aloud in Margaret's steady, unhurried voice. Nathaniel closed his eyes. Did you write this? His attorney asked, already knowing the answer. He didn't respond. Who were you referring to? Silence. Mr. Ashworth, Margaret said, did you write this? Yes. The room went very still. I sat with my hands folded, watching 16 years of certainty about who this man was quietly rearrange itself into something else entirely. Then Margaret pulled out one more email, this one from Diane, Nathaniel's mother, sent to her son. If Walter left her the properties, don't let her walk away with everything. You have a right to your share. I read it once, and my chest tightened in a way that had nothing to do with money. In 16 years, Diane had never once asked how I was handling my grandfather's death, whether I was grieving, whether I needed anything at all. She had gone straight to asking about property. That was the moment I stopped waiting for an explanation, because I finally understood there wasn't going to be one that made any of this better. My mother was upset, Nathaniel said. She didn't understand the full situation. She understood enough to email you about what I owned, I said. He had nothing to say to that. Outside on the sidewalk afterward, a cold wind moving down the block, he caught up to me. Claire, can we talk? Not like that in there, actually talk. I turned to face him. We've been talking for weeks. My mother shouldn't have sent that email. No, she was worried about your future. About our family, he said. You mean about your financial future? He didn't argue. You don't understand what this money is going to do, he said finally. I almost smiled. I understand exactly what it's already done. It showed me who you are. His face hardened. You think you're better than me now? No, I said, shaking my head. I think I'm finally seeing you clearly, for the first time in a long time. For 1 second I saw the man I'd actually married, tired, frightened, human, cornered by his own choices. I almost felt something soften in me. Then I remembered a marble column in a Seattle hotel lobby and a sentence I would never fully unhear. She doesn't have the money to fight me. Whatever sympathy I had left evaporated on the spot. That night Margaret called with the final figure. We're ready, she said. The valuation came back complete. How much? A pause, 31.4 million. I sat down slowly at the kitchen table. For years, I had measured wealth in mortgage payments and grocery totals and the cost of new soccer cleats. I had never once imagined a number like that attached to my own name. It didn't make me feel powerful. It made me feel exposed, like every door in my life had suddenly lost its lock. I thought about what my grandfather had written. Money could buy options. It could buy time. It could buy the best attorneys in the state. But it couldn't buy character. And Nathaniel was about to learn that particular lesson in the most public room available to him. I woke before my alarm on the morning of the final hearing and lay still, listening to the ordinary sounds of the house, the refrigerator humming, a car passing outside, Lily's door creaking as the heat kicked on. It felt like any other morning. By the end of the day, nothing in our family would feel ordinary again. I dressed in a navy suit and studied myself in the mirror. tired, not weak. 16 years had taught me that some battles aren't won by shouting. They're won by staying calm long enough that the truth becomes impossible to talk over. Margaret met me outside the courthouse, ready. As I'll ever be. Remember, don't react to him. Let the evidence do the talking. Inside, Nathaniel sat beside his attorney, looking almost cheerful, one ankle resting on his knee. He caught my eye and smiled the Seattle smile. Behind him, Diane sat in a cream-colored suit, composed, until she glanced at me and quickly looked away. The judge entered. The room stood, then sat, and the hearing began exactly as expected: the house, the retirement accounts, the vehicles, custody schedules. Then Nathaniel's attorney raised the inheritance. Your Honor, there remain open questions regarding the extent of Mrs. Ashworth's inherited assets. Ms. Hale, the judge said, looking to Margaret. Margaret stood and handed folders to the clerk. We've provided full documentation, trust records, estate filings, property valuations, and the final appraisal. The judge reviewed each in turn, then looked up at Nathaniel's attorney. Mr. Ashworth's filing characterizes his wife's financial position as uncertain, yet these records are remarkably specific. We believe certain assets may still be relevant to the division of marital property, the attorney said carefully. That's a separate question from whether the assets exist at all, the judge replied, and turned to Nathaniel directly. Mr. Ashworth, did you have knowledge of this trust prior to filing for divorce? Nathaniel shifted in his seat. I knew there might be an inheritance. Did you investigate the trust before filing? I asked questions, through counsel. Then your characterization of your wife's financial position, as uncertain, appears somewhat misleading. Nathaniel said nothing. His attorney whispered something urgent that didn't seem to help. The judge turned back to Margaret. Is there a verified valuation? Yes, Your Honor. Margaret handed over the final report. The room fell silent except for the faint tick of the wall clock while the judge read. Mrs. Ashworth, the judge said, looking up. Yes, Your Honor. Are these records accurate to the best of your knowledge? Yes. Have you knowingly concealed any assets from this court? No. The judge nodded once, then turned to Nathaniel. The evidence before this court indicates your wife holds substantial inherited assets. A pause. The verified valuation places her current net worth at approximately $31.4 million. The room went completely still. Someone behind me inhaled sharply. Nathaniel's confidence didn't fade, it collapsed, all at once, like a building losing its foundation. He stared at me, and this time it wasn't calculation in his eyes. It was something closer to regret, arriving about 3 weeks too late to matter. You never told me, he said. You never asked, I answered quietly. You investigated. His attorney touched his arm. Don't, but he wasn't listening anymore. You knew, this whole time you knew. I learned the final number last week, same as you. He turned back to the judge. So she gets all of it. That is not what I said, the judge answered evenly, and explained patiently that the existence of substantial inherited assets did not automatically make them marital property subject to division. That depended on how they had been inherited, titled, and maintained, and on the law that governed all of it. Nathaniel's shoulders dropped a visible inch. He had spent weeks imagining a number and a future built around it. The law, it turned out, cared nothing for what he had imagined. It cared only about documentation, and the documentation was mine. Behind us, a sharp sound cut through the room. Diane had stood up too fast. 31 million, she said, her face draining of color. She reached for the back of her chair. Mom, Nathaniel said, sit down. Her knees gave out before he could reach her. Someone called for help. The judge called a recess while the room dissolved into motion around a woman crumpled in a folding chair. I stood completely still through all of it. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt tired and sad, and strangely far away from my own body. When Diane came to, her eyes found mine across the room. There was no anger left in them, only shock and something that looked almost like shame. During the recess, Nathaniel approached me in the hallway. He looked older than he had that morning. "I didn't know," he said. "I know. If I'd known." "That is exactly the problem," I said. He looked confused, so I said it plainly. "You loved the life you thought I could give you. You never loved the person standing in front of you enough to find out." He had nothing to say to that. The proceedings resumed, the financial claims were sorted according to the law and the evidence, and his attempt to fold my grandfather's estate into the marital pot was rejected, piece by piece, the way a building comes down floor by floor instead of all at once. When it was finally over, I understood something I hadn't expected to learn in a courtroom. I had spent weeks terrified of losing everything, but I had never actually stopped to ask myself what everything meant. It wasn't the trust. It wasn't the properties. It wasn't $31.4 million. It was my children, my composure, my ability to wake up every morning without wondering whether the person beside me was quietly appraising my worth. Nathaniel stood near the courthouse doors afterward, and for the first time in 16 years, he didn't seem to know what to say to me. I didn't either. So I walked past him, not out of hatred, but because I was finally ready to walk toward a life he no longer had any say in. 3 months after the hearing, my life got quieter. Not perfect, just quieter. The divorce was finalized. The house stopped holding its breath between arguments. Nathaniel moved into an apartment across town, and we settled into a parenting schedule that let Owen and Lily move between us without whiplash. At first the kids struggled. Lily asked whether we'd ever have a real Thanksgiving together again. Owen mostly stopped asking questions at all. I learned that children don't need every detail explained to them. They need consistency. They need proof that the adults in their lives will keep showing up. So I showed up. Every pickup, every parent-teacher conference, every soccer game, every night Lily needed her closet checked for monsters. When Nathaniel came for his weekends, I kept my voice level. "Have a good weekend. You too." No warmth left between us, but eventually something like respect. One Saturday morning, he arrived early and lingered on the porch, hands in his coat pockets. "Can I talk to you?" I stepped out and closed the door behind me. "What is it?" "I've been going to counseling." "That's good." "I know I don't owe you an update on that. I've just been thinking about what you said in court." He looked at the ground. "That I lost you because I thought you were worthless when I believed you were poor." I said nothing, waiting. "I deserved that," he said. "I spent years thinking earning more money made me more important in this family. I didn't understand how much you were actually carrying." Behind me, I heard Lily thundering down the stairs, Owen close behind with his backpack over one shoulder. I turned back to Nathaniel. "I'm glad you're seeing it now." "I wish I'd seen it sooner." "So do I." He hesitated. "Do you ever think we could?" "Nathaniel." "I know," he nodded, and for once there was no argument behind it, no pleading. Maybe that was the first real evidence that something in him had actually shifted. "I don't want you to hate me," he said. "I don't." "Why not?" "Because I refuse to spend the rest of my life carrying you around in my head." He gave a small, sad smile. "I understand." I mostly believed him. That afternoon I visited Diane. She'd called several times, and I finally agreed. She looked smaller than I remembered, sitting quietly at her own kitchen table, pouring coffee with hands that weren't quite steady. "I owe you an apology," she said. "Yes, you do." When I heard about the inheritance, I thought about what it could mean for Nathaniel. Security, his future. "You thought about the money." She nodded, not defending it. "I did." "You didn't think about me." "No," she admitted. "I didn't." She wiped her eyes. "I was wrong about you. I treated you like you weren't good enough for my son, and it turns out I had no idea what good enough even meant." "I know," I said. Forgiveness, I was learning, doesn't require trust to come rushing back in behind it. It just means you stop carrying someone else's cruelty around like a debt they owe you forever. Before I left, she asked, "What are you going to do with all that money?" I smiled, something my grandfather would recognize. I kept enough to secure my children's future and maintain the properties responsibly. But I wanted the inheritance to mean something past the size of a number in an account. With Margaret's help and a small team of financial advisors, I set up education trusts for Owen and Lily and started a modest family foundation focused on financial literacy for people who'd never had anyone sit them down and explain what a trust even was. Not flashy, not headline-worthy, just useful. Because I had lived 41 years assuming financial planning was something only wealthy people needed to think about, until it nearly cost me everything I actually valued. A will tells the world what you want done with your estate. A trust can give you far more control and protection, depending on how it's built. And when someone comes into a significant inheritance, the smartest first move isn't a new car or an announcement at Thanksgiving dinner. It's finding people you trust and asking every question you're embarrassed not to already know the answer to. I learned that lesson at full price. I also learned something about marriage that I wish someone had told me at 25. Love doesn't require you to surrender financial awareness. Trust doesn't mean signing whatever's placed in front of you without reading it twice. And raising children full-time was never worth less just because it didn't come with a paycheck attached. For years, I let Nathaniel's income quietly become the measuring stick for my value in our own home. That was my mistake to fix. His mistake was believing the measurement was accurate. One evening months later, I sat on the back porch with Owen and Lily while the sun went down behind the tree line. "Mom," Lily said, leaning into my shoulder, "are you happier now?" The honest answer surprised even me. "Yes." She smiled, "Good." Owen was quiet for a moment, then said, "I think Dad's happier too." "Why do you think that?" "He doesn't act angry all the time anymore." I nodded. Sometimes people have to lose something before they understand what it was actually worth. Lily thought about that. Do we still have to call him Dad? I laughed, really laughed, for the first time in what felt like months. "Yes, sweetheart, he's still your dad." She giggled, and for a few minutes, the three of us just sat there laughing about nothing in particular together, on an ordinary evening that no longer felt like it was waiting for something to go wrong. That's when I finally understood what my grandfather meant in his letter. The real inheritance was never $31.4 million. It was the lesson underneath it. Know your own worth before someone else tries to assign you one. Protect what's been entrusted to you. Learn enough about money that no one can quietly maneuver around your ignorance ever again. And never, under any circumstances, confuse what someone owns with who they actually are. Nathaniel thought he was walking away from a woman with nothing. He discovered, in the worst possible room, that he'd been married to someone worth more than he could imagine, and that he'd already thrown it away before he ever found out. But that isn't even the real twist of this story. The real twist is that by the time the judge read that brr out loud, I had already found something worth infinitely more than it. My own worth, intact, entirely mine, regardless of what anyone else decided it was. The money changed my circumstances. The truth is what actually changed me. And when I think back to that courtroom now, to Diane collapsing into her chair, to Nathaniel's face when the number finally landed, I don't feel triumphant. I feel grateful. Grateful the truth surfaced before I spent another 10 years trying to prove my worth to people who had already quietly decided what I was worth to them. If any part of this reminded you of something from your own life, take a moment tonight and ask yourself what your own inheritance really is. Maybe it isn't money at all. Maybe it's a lesson from a parent, or the scar tissue from a hard marriage, or simply the courage to start completely over when everything you built turns out to be standing on the wrong foundation. And if someone has ever underestimated you, I'd genuinely love to hear that story in the comments. Your experience might be exactly what someone else needs to read today. If this one stayed with you, consider subscribing for more stories about family, resilience, and the quiet, patient kind of strength it takes to begin again. Because sometimes the loudest kind of justice is simply refusing to disappear.